Okay, guys, as you're taking your seats, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce the guest speaker for today, Derek Risch. Derek is a wildlife ecologist with a focus on quantitative methods, including ecological modeling, spatial prioritizations, and GIS approaches to wildlife management. He's NREM alumni and graduated with his master's in 2019. And he currently works with Dr. Price in the Wildlife Ecology Lab and is focused on how we can better understand the spatial ecology of ungulates in Hawaii to help inform decision-making. Please join me in welcoming Derek.
All right, well, thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I do a lot of research on wild ungulates in Hawaii, and today I'll be sharing some of that work over the past few years, including some of the work that went into my master's thesis. So as mentioned, I graduated from this program, the master's program in 2019. And so I'm a little unfamiliar with being on this side of the podium in the seminar series. I'm more familiar in your all seats, but looking forward to having a conversation with you all afterward and answering any questions you may have about ungulates, the work that I've worked on. So first and foremost, I wanted to thank my co-authors. So Jason Omick at the Division of Forestry and Wildlife, who's really helped fund this project over the last few years, and my advisor in the department and PI on the project, Dr. Melissa Price. I also wanted to thank all the many people who have gone into helping and really making this project successful over the last 6 or 7 years. We've worked on 4 of the main Hawaiian islands, and you can imagine anytime you start research on another island, it takes a lot of logistics and support from people. So all of our field techs, all of the forestry and wildlife staff, all of the UH staff, really it's their help that's helped make this project what it is today. So before I get into kind of the research and the nitty-gritty of things, I thought I'd start with a little primer on ungulates in Hawaii. And when I say ungulates, it's kind of jargon, but basically any hoofed mammal is an ungulate. So you think of deer, goats, pigs, and in our case, we have quite a few of them, all of which intentionally introduced by humans at some point in the past. And so in the top right, you can kind of see the timeline. Here, let me see if this. There we go. The timeline of ungulate introductions throughout our island's history, dating all the way back to the arrival of the first Polynesians and indigenous Hawaiian people, bringing over the pigs, to more recent introductions of, in this case, in 1961 and 1954, black-tailed deer and mouflon sheep. And if you take a look at all the islands there, we have different assemblages of these species depending on which island you're looking at. And so it's important to take those factors into account when doing any kind of management. Okay, so I wanted to spend a little time. I'm not going to spend a super long time going into detail on each of these ungulate species, but I wanted to highlight a few to give you all some context of their basic biology and what brought them to the islands. And so feral pigs is probably the most easily recognizable species of this assortment up there. They're present on most of the main Hawaiian islands except for Lanai and Ho'olave. And I mentioned having been initially brought over by Polynesians. They kind of co-evolved with indigenous Hawaiian communities and therefore have significant cultural value to those people. But also with the subsequent introduction of European pigs and other varieties of pigs, these pigs quickly became feral. And once they're feral and on the landscape, they have a number of detrimental impacts to the environment. And this is probably one most people are familiar with, their rooting and digging behavior, which is actually unique behavior to this species. None of the other ungulates we have present in the Hawaiian Islands do this type of behavior. And you can see that all of the soil is churned up. It's very difficult for plants to establish there. But not only is this a problem, not very many people think of pigs as predators, but sure enough, they'll predate on basically anything that's in front of them. And so ground nesting birds, which we have quite a few indigenous ground nesting seabirds, and also on the mainland, amphibians and reptiles. So here's just some snippets that we picked up on our game cameras of pigs rooting through the soil. And you can see there's basically no ground cover in this forest. And so, you know, we have pretty steep gradients here in Hawaii, slope wise, and also rainfall wise, we get pretty dramatic rainfall events. And so you can imagine the next rainfall event coming through and washing that soil down to our nearshore waters. And I'm sure most of us here have seen those large sediment plumes at the mouths of our rivers and streams. Moving on to access deer, present throughout Maui Nui. So Maui, Lanai, and Molokai. And you can see, you know, pretty prominent species on those islands. I'm not sure if you've all been following the news, but they've been pretty prevalent in the news on Maui just due to the sheer population sizes. You know, car strikes, browsing on vegetation. They've been hugely problematic throughout Maui Nui in recent years, and for various reasons, but one of them is because this many species, these many animals will move through an area and denude all vegetation there. And so serious problems in terms of erosional issues. So here's about, I'll just let this one play, but this is about a 2-minute video. This isn't work that we do, but this was provided to us by folks at Maui Nui. And I thought it conveyed the problem at hand throughout Maui Nui and the sheer number of animals on the landscape there. And so this is about a 2-minute video. All of the white dots you see in this video are access deer. And this is a single private landowner on Maui. And so that raises additional concerns. If this many animals are on one private landowner's property, how does that private landowner maintain and control for that many animals? So I'll just let it play. It kind of goes without saying there are no natural predators of any of these animals throughout the islands besides hunters. Yeah, so all those dots you see there. Here. Throughout the course of the video, there's thousands of them, just if you were trying to play numbers in your head. Oh, a lot of deer on Maui and throughout Maui Nui. Moving on to goats, present on most of the main Hawaiian islands. And sorry, I should have oriented you there. Obviously, all the red islands there are where this species is present. But goats have much the same issues with deer, and that the sheer movement of these animals across the landscape creates game trails, which lead to erosional problems. They have serious overbrowsing problems in certain areas. Unlike deer though, goats really like sloped areas. And so you'll find these, on the edges of cliffs and things like that, where other ungulate species might not be present. So here's just a snippet. This is on Kauai, pretty remote area. We had to get flown into this location. And so, they're out there in some of the most remote locations. And it's, if you have to get flown in there, it's hard to manage the animals because you can't just hike in or drive in. And then lastly, I thought I just mentioned mouflon sheep here. I think the theme is the same across the species, a bunch of different detrimental impacts from erosion to vegetation browsing. But I thought I'd showcase mouflon sheep here because they were intentionally introduced relatively recently in the 50s for game hunting. And you can see, you know, if you're a trophy hunter, that's a fairly valuable trophy. And so there's some value placed there from a hunting perspective, and they're present on Hawaii Island and Lanai. And if you're familiar with mouflon sheep, they were introduced, and shortly after their introduction, there was huge impacts to mamane forests on Hawaii Island. And so, you know, there was pretty rapid response to trying to control the number of animals on the landscape. But yeah, they're still present on those two islands. So here gives you an idea of like that many animals moving across, you know, all those game trails, all the barren soil, and exposed earth. Makes it challenging from a land management perspective. So I think we get the idea that, you know, there's these different values placed on these animals, and there's all these detrimental impacts from those animals. And so looking forward, how can we manage them? And unfortunately, it turns out this is equally challenging for a number of reasons, but one being that there's a lot of different land ownership and land management in Hawaii, whether it's private versus public. These animals don't care, they'll cross those jurisdictional boundaries, and when you're trying to manage a population of animals, it's difficult to do so if that population, you know, goes across these boundaries. And so that's one challenge with managing these animals. The next challenge is that even within those jurisdictional boundaries, so say we're looking at public lands, forestry and wildlife is tasked with managing these species. Within their jurisdiction, they have conflicting mandates. So they have one mandate where they have to maintain a viable hunting program, which means they have to give access to these game resources to the public, while simultaneously, you know, they're mandated to protect and conserve our native ecosystem. So you can imagine those are kind of in conflict with each other. So how do you do both of those things at the same time? And so these were kind of the management actions and decisions that we were considering when we were trying to figure out what information we might need to make more informed decisions. And so here's a pretty oversimplified version of an island. You know, we have our hunting units, we have our agricultural and rangelands, we have our conservation areas, and we kind of know where those places are. But what we don't know is where those species and animals are across that spectrum. And so that was kind of what we had identified early on, is how can we get at information about where those animals are at these kind of population scale or island-wide scales, and not only where they are, but what are the drivers and why are they moving around the landscape, so that we can, you know, maybe better manage them and introduce management actions in association with their species biology. And so that led us to, you know, years and years of field surveys. So dating all the way back to 2016 on Oahu, where I was actually just involved as a field tech, running out game cameras. And then we moved on to Maui in 2018, where I completed my master's thesis, and then on to Kauai. And we just wrapped up a field season on Hawaii Island just several months ago, and are, you know, chugging through the data now. But yeah, all of those red points are survey locations that we went out and surveyed for these ungulate species. And in each of those survey locations, we did two different types of methodologies. So we used game cameras attached to trees or poles, and we set out 6 of them at each of those survey locations. We left those out for 2 weeks, and then we collected them and looked at, you know, different counts of different ungulate species on those game cameras. We also did sign surveys. So at each camera location within the survey location, we rolled out tape and we looked for sign of ungulate presence. And that could be as simple as, you know, ungulate tracks walking through an area, a pig walks through in the mud, you can see their tracks, established game trails, or scat or droppings. And so all of these things we were recording, whether it was the game cameras or the sign surveys at each survey location. And using that data, we kind of did a standard, you know, species distribution modeling approach where we use those two data as inputs into species distribution models. And to kind of just streamline the process here, I won't get into the nitty-gritty. If you want to talk about it and are interested, we can talk about it afterward. I'll be around, but you can use those count data. You can bring in different environmental variables. And so these things are like rainfall, vegetation height, vegetation density, and you can start to correlate the detections of those animals with different environmental variables at the site. And so using those correlations, you can then predict out to an island-wide scale what that distribution might look like. And so the next few slides are going to be our distribution models, and so it's going to be a little math heavy, and I can slow it down if I'm going through them too fast, but I'll orient you to the first one here, and this is the final product. This is the distribution model, in this case for pigs on Maui, and so you can see in the bottom left there the scale. So the lighter yellow is going to be lower abundance, and then the deep reds are going to be the higher abundance of pigs. The table on the left is going to be the covariates that went into the model. In this case, it's annual rainfall, vegetation height, vegetation density, and distance to mesic/wet forest. And so you can see here, what we were finding was that pigs really preferred kind of a middle elevation with kind of a moderate rainfall. And the distance to mesic/wet forest was actually a significant covariate, and that was kind of an interesting one because we were seeing that they needed the forest, so they preferred the forest. They wouldn't really venture out past a certain distance, past forested areas. In addition to that, they liked areas with increasing vegetation height. So taller the canopy, more likely you were going to see pigs in the area. Access deer. I'm sorry, it might look a little washed out up on the slide there, but access deer, you can see the distribution is quite a bit different. Mostly deer throughout the saddle, so they preferred much drier, arid areas than pigs. Yeah, the annual rainfall, vegetation height, native cover were the significant covariates in that model. And something interesting of note here was that we did the Maui surveys back in 2018. And we presented these models over a number of years. In some areas that we had predicted deer to be abundant back in 2018, they weren't actually currently being observed there. And then just only in the last year or so, some of those areas when we presented, people have been like, well, we're seeing them here now. So unfortunately, our model of predicted areas of where they might be most abundant is probably more of a reality now. And I think it's an important thing to know because I think oftentimes people think of these populations as static, but a lot of our ungulates have been introduced within the last century, or in some cases within the last few decades. And they're really dynamic populations and moving, throughout the years. And then feral goats. So fairly similar to deer in their distribution, although we found that they didn't really mind elevation. You'll see them at the highest elevations throughout the islands, and really preferred really dry, arid areas. So those deep reds on the southern tip of East Maui are kind of like old lava fields. We pick up thousands of photos of goats in those areas. I'll glance over this really quick, but just to say that you can take a deeper dive into these models, aside from just like producing a baseline distribution map of the species, you can dive a little deeper. And this was a paper we published a few years ago looking at the seasonality of pigs on Maui, and we were finding that there were pretty significant differences in the distribution of pigs on Maui. And we were thinking in the paper, we highlight that probably the most significant drivers in those distributions were kind of weather conditions and also hunting pressure, because there's various hunting seasons throughout Maui, and we found that played kind of a significant role in the distribution of pigs over there. Moving on to Kauai, this is the pig distribution on Kauai. Very similar trends on that island in terms of kind of moderate rainfall, moderate elevation were highly desirable by pigs. And then in this model, annual rainfall, native vegetation density, NDVI was significant, and that's basically just a satellite imagery of the graining of vegetation. And so they were preferring areas that were greener in vegetation. And then interestingly, on Hawaii, we took kind of a new approach and incorporated other species abundance metrics into the modeling process. And so deer actually proved to be a significant covariate in this model. And so there was some kind of species interaction happening there between the deer abundance and the pig abundance on Hawaii. Black-tailed deer distribution, annual rainfall, elevation, native vegetation density, and slope. You'll see that it's a much different distribution than pigs. A lot of areas there were predicted no deer at all. And that's likely due to, and I'll show you in the subsequent slides, it's likely due to the recency of their introduction. So they were just, well, I say just, but introduced in the 60s, whereas pigs have been established on Hawaii for 1,000 years or so. And so mostly constrained to the Waimea and Alakai Plateau. And if we take a little bit of a closer look here, this map on the left was produced in 1974, about 10 years after their initial introduction. And if you see the white dot on Western Hawaii with the deer in it, that's where the deer were initially released. And so in 1974, about 10 years after the introduction, they had done a study and looked at the range of deer at that point in time. And they were like, okay, the deer are mostly around the area which we introduced them. And they theorized when introducing them that where they're going to stay kind of in this non-native forest based on studies on the mainland. But after we completed our surveys in 2021, we actually saw that they were moving more into the wet kind of native ecosystems of the Alakai Plateau. And so that's interesting and important of note because that area is some of the last remaining critical habitat on Hawaii. And so if we take a look at that, a lot of the island endemics, this is very important habitat for their survival, both plants and birds. Hawaii has one of the highest rates of island endemics throughout the state. And you can see the black outline there is the critical habitat. So a lot of overlap between deer distribution now and the remaining critical habitat on Hawaii. I should note this isn't the total remaining critical habitat. If you zoom out, there's certain pockets on high elevation areas throughout Hawaii, but this is the largest remaining critical habitat on the island. And likewise, pigs have a pretty considerable overlap with that habitat as well. I should mention here, I don't have distribution models for you all for Hawaii Island. This is all of our survey locations that we visited over the last year. We've processed somewhere in the ballpark of like 700,000 photos and are still working on an additional 600,000. And so I'm hoping to have those models ready for everybody soon. But this gives you an idea of the spread of those survey locations on that island. And to kind of wrap things up and to summarize things here, just with a little summary slide. So our initial goal was to provide a baseline for the ungulate distribution abundance. This can be used for a number of different things. Just understanding where our resources are and where these invasive species are is really important for not only conservation, but game management, but also for our crops and livestock because they have considerable impacts on our food security. And so the secondary bullet of that is like we can prioritize where to allocate our funds and resources. We can use those maps to see where there might be hotspot areas where these species are most abundant and might be causing the most problems. And then finally, I mentioned the kind of conflicting objectives and goals of various areas throughout the islands. And using these maps, I'm hoping that we can minimize conflict between those goals and objectives by recognizing trade-off areas. And so I think I've left a considerable chunk for discussion and going over the work that we've been working on over the last few years. So with that, I'll leave it with questions, kind of a discussion. Thanks. Yeah.
So on that last slide of the red dots on the island, was that a population or like what quantity of like?
Yeah, so This is just our survey location, so I'm hoping to get at your question and answer that question with our models that are coming out. So these are just showing where we set out game cameras and conducted surveys and stuff. And so we had, I think like 1.2, 1.3 million photos from our game cameras. So there's considerable lag time in like using game cameras, if anybody's used them before, where you just have an enormous amount of data that you have to process. And so we're in the data processing stage, and so I can't say population wise and distribution, but that's just to say where we've surveyed, yeah.
And is there any catch and release programs like you put a tag on the tractor?
We're not doing that. I know various people are doing collaring studies and things of that nature to look at home range and distance traveled. We're just doing passive monitoring with game cameras, so we're just picking up whatever walks across our camera. Yeah.
What's been your process for like getting access or not getting access to like private land where you might want to take surveys?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, access is a big, it's hard, it's a big hurdle for any kind of field work. Thankfully, we're partnered with the Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and so we get access to all the forest reserves and natural areas through their permitting protocols, but we also reach out to any landowners that might be interested on the island, and it's more of like a natural process of like, oh, which areas can we get access to, and talking to those folks. But we typically partner with like ranchers or larger landowners, yeah.
How can you avoid much of a big part of the park on the island?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we avoid areas that are fenced. And so the idea being that everything within the fence line is no ungulates, and so we're not trying to survey, we're trying to model what it would be naturally. Like if there were no fence lines, our models are showing where the ungulates might be most abundant, and so we avoid areas where they're presumed to be zero, because we would hopefully get zero data there. Yeah. Good question.
Kind of related to that, did you consider factoring that into the models themselves? Because I just like the Maui model, you'd show really high density in like West Maui, Kuwi area.
Yeah.
Up high, and like theoretically, like you're saying, if there weren't fences, that could be the abundance, but in reality, it's like there's just like a band.
Yeah.
Of abundance.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I presented the models today with no barriers to animal movement. We've done additional modeling, including the like excluded areas, so like ungulate fences. I know West Maui has a bunch of strategic fencing in certain areas are ungulate free, and so I didn't present those today, but I do have models where, you know, all of those areas that are excluded due to ungulate fences. And it does change the dynamic. Like if you cut out certain areas, there's a lot of areas that we predicted on Maui that were most abundant were fenced. And presumably there's no animals there. And so if you cut out those areas, the next most suitable habitat might be just outside the fence line, and then that pops up. So yeah, good question.
We have an online question from Michael Gray. Are you using Mega Detector or Wildlife Insights to sort your photos?
Yeah. Hey, Mike. Yeah, so we started using Mega Detector on Hawaii Island. And for those of you who are not familiar, it's like essentially an AI that goes through and automates all the camera photos. So we have, you know, of the 1.3 million photos, I would say like 80% of them are non-targets, like no species, just a, you know, vegetation moving. And so we did start using AI to process all of our photos. And I found it super helpful. Unfortunately, Mega Detector only does object identification, and so it tells you whether there's something in the frame or not in the frame. But there are some other AI that do species identification on top of that. So you can kind of just automate that whole process. But right now we do Mega Detector, and so it does object detection, and then we have to go back through all the ones that have objects in them and identify the species ourselves manually. But yeah, great question.
Yeah,
Did you check the accuracy of this AI detection? How accurate it is?
Yeah, so we are in the process, this is the first time we've implemented it on Hawaii Island. Mega detector has been like used across, we're actually kind of behind the curve. A lot of people have used mega detector for years. And their accuracy statistics are upwards of like 95%. So I'm gonna basically ground truth. We've gone through half of our data manually without object detection. And then we're going through the other half with object detection, and so we can compare there to see if there's, you know, significant error on the model side or the AI side versus just manually processing, but. Yeah, good question, because you don't want to just plug in something and trust the AI or whatever to run it, yeah.
So we've got, I think, 3 more questions online, so I'll feed those to you. So the first one is from Kalea Paiva. And she says, is there an annual estimate of deer population on Maui that is accessible to the public? Public awareness of the deer abundance could incentivize people to attain hunting licenses and bring the population down. And maybe you want to give a shout out to Wade's research while you're at it. That's me adding, not what she said.
So I think the question was deer population on Maui. Our research is not population estimates, it's a relative abundance metric, so it's a little bit different. I know there was some work done by Steve Hess that did some population modeling on Maui. But that's the only one I'm familiar with. Population estimates are like notoriously very difficult to quantify. And so we had attempted that early on in our research. Essentially, you need to like individually ID animals and get repeat detections of that. So mark recapture type studies. And it turns out it's very difficult to do that for most of the species in Hawaii, especially pigs. Most of them are black of uniform size. So they all look fairly similar. I would be curious to see if that be possible. I know they've done it on like giraffes and, you know, all the megafauna in Africa, identifying spots and things like that. And I'm wondering if that's possible on axis deer on Maui, but we haven't attempted it.
Did you want to give a shout out to Wade's research?
Yeah, Wade, upcoming grad student, is going to be working on axis deer on Maui, and so yeah, he's very interested in movement ecology and various. I think he's thinking about doing a population viability analysis of deer on Maui, and so there might be some information coming out shortly. Yeah, question though.
And so sorry, we've got one more question online and then we'll take questions in person again. So from Emma Ewan, is there any specific insights your study tells us for management and fence planning? For instance, are the specific places we are fencing are there specific places we are fencing that wouldn't have ungulates or have a super low amount anyway?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's sorry, it was a long question. It was.
And you can pop up the chat there too if
Oh,
you want to
yeah.
hear it, just to make it a little easier for yourself. Yeah, right there, yeah.
Yeah, so our models have shown, so I've done, as I mentioned with the other modeling and the other question of like pulling up the ungulate fences and looking at how that affects our distribution models. A lot of the areas, or I shouldn't say a lot, but there are certain areas where there's existing fencing that would have substantial populations of ungulates. There are other areas where you know, there might not be as many ungulates within that fence line. But it's difficult to say, you know, the impact of a few ungulates versus the impact of a lot of ungulates, right? So if there's an ungulate fence in an area where there's few ungulates, but your native ecosystem resources there, they're very vulnerable species. You could have 1 or 2 pigs in that fence line, and they could decimate a population. And so I think our models could be used to inform. I think our models need to be used in conjunction with other types of distributions, such as, you know, native plant distribution or sensitive and threatened species distributions, to kind of, you know, inform those types of decisions. So I don't think our model is the end all be all to say where ungulate fences are, but I think they're an important asset to use with those other spatial products. Yeah, but great question. Yeah, you had a question?
Oh, not a question, but just like a comment to the other question about incentivizing hunting. in Maui? Because I understand that getting a population density is difficult. But just even showing that video that you had up earlier, that's a pretty like wow factor image or
Yeah.
video right there in and of itself that could be used for like public outreach and trying to incentivize people to get licenses.
Yeah, and I think the challenging thing on Maui is that a lot of the deer are on private lands. And so throughout that saddle region on Maui, it's not on, you know, a lot of the land isn't public land where the state has jurisdiction. Or where, you know, public hunting program where folks could go in, and so, there's those challenges where those private landowners are faced with managing that population. And you know, they're already strapped for resources, and in a lot of cases, it's ranchers, throughout that saddle area, and so, you know, it's difficult to, you know, pour money into control efforts on top of their current operations, and so, yeah.
In relation to that, you have a question? Yeah. Is the Axis deer meat taste good?
I think so. I think venison tastes good. Yeah.
Anybody trying to make a business out of it?
So that video that I showed was Maui Nui Venison. So they commercialized the harvest of
Okay.
access deer on Maui. And so they sell products, things like that. But I think they're the only, aside from like cafes and things like that, I know sell product. It's really difficult to market wild meat, which is kind of the barrier to entry for a lot of this stuff, because it has to be USDA certified and all of that, so you couldn't just go kill a deer and then sell it at market, yeah.
And a shout out to Jared Char, one of our other former
Yeah.
graduate students, another alumnus is working with Maui Venison now.
Okay.
So yeah, there has to be a single kill shot to the head observed by the USDA inspector. So they have to be there in person on site, and there's not even someone based on Maui, at least there wasn't 5 years ago. So they have to fly them over
So,
to see the kill shot and pay for it. So I mean, it's really a significant financial burden for
Okay.
people trying to make a business out of it. I think you don't have to have that USDA inspector on site. If you want to use it for dog meat, there's different rules. So I think that there's someone making a business out of that, or multiple people, but yeah, very interesting options. I thought of Willie's hand and Mehana's hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about Maui Nui Venison too, if you see more of that. More private players getting involved in the future and. Maybe some that don't charge $300 for pounds.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that it would. You know, the cost of the meat would come down. I know the reason the cost of the meat is so high is for that very reason, is that you have to have a USDA inspector, you have to pay them to come out. And I'm not most up to date on it, but last I heard there's only like 1 or 2 or a handful of them. And so they're really strapped. And to have more businesses come in, you have to hire more inspectors and things like that. So that's the biggest barrier. And I would hope that more would come on and the price of the product would come down, because there's a lot of product. Yeah. Mehana, you had a question?
I just wanted to say it's so amazing to see this, because I know this is so many years of work, and you've really helped, you know, from being an undergrad in NREM to a grad student in NREM, and you really helped to pilot sort of this approach of cameras and what you found. And I guess I just wondered about your journey a little bit and how it's been. And because probably there were some huge hurdles, and then also how it's being received, you know, with agencies, and I know you've interacted with hunters on different islands.
Journey. Yeah, so I actually started as an NREM undergraduate. And I was working on totally unrelated things. I was really interested in coastal ecology. And then I got a field job working on this project on Oahu back in 2016. And carried on through 2017, just putting out cameras and stuff. And I guess saying yes to a bunch of things just led me to grad school and working under Dr. Melissa Price. And completing my thesis there. But yeah, I don't know who wants, if you guys want to chat about like, I don't know, grad school and stuff like that, I'd be happy to. But yeah, I think a lot of it just came from like opportunities coming up and saying yes. And yeah, I was very fortunate in my pathway, but yeah. And then the other question, what was your other question? Sorry.
But you've also kind of created a job and a specialty and a huge, you know, accumulation of knowledge, and I just wondered how it's being received in the public and agencies and community.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've presented, obviously, we work really closely with DLNR. And so we present to the managers on each of the respective islands that we go to. And it's well received by them. I know Jason Omick's very involved, and he's actually the game program coordinator. And he's very passionate about getting these models for each of the islands for their management decisions. And we presented to GMAC, so there's a Game Management Advisory Commission, which is basically an assemblage of hunters, representatives for each island that are used to advise DLNR in the state on anything pertaining to the game program. And it's been well received on that side as well. And we've just started in the last year or so, and moving forward, we've gotten funding from the USDA to run projects with the ranching and producer community. And so I fly out tomorrow, Melissa flies out tomorrow, Wade flies out tomorrow, and we're going to Cattlemen's Council to kind of share some of the work as well. And so I think and hope that it's been well received, and all the conversations I have been productive. But yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, and students, they're done, we have one more online question.
Okay.
Thanks for an awesome presentation. This question's more topic general, but I was wondering, with all of your work with the state, do you have any programs or funding allocated for supporting community members interested in hunting? Because I can imagine getting all this supplies is expensive, and you need to have the training. So wondering what kind of support in any areas.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know they run a Hunter Ed course, and all of those. They have like various workshops. I wouldn't be the best person to talk to about that. But I know, and they run like a newsletter to inform the hunting community and anybody who's registered for a hunting license, a state hunting license. I wouldn't be the best to talk to, but I would agree that it's similar to like marketing access there. There's a big barrier to entry to hunting. Like you have to learn from someone who's done it before, and it's often hard to find someone who's hunted, and especially now. And so I know they're working on it. I can't say any particular programs, but yeah.
There's the Go Hunt Hawaii newsletter, and that's where you could reach out to them and ask them about their education programs. Or there's some fantastic women hunters in the natural resource management community too. If you're interested in connecting with some, if you'd love to be mentored under another woman who's maybe 10 years ahead of you in age and stage of career, there's some pretty fantastic hunters out there. Yeah, we have a comment actually online, which is from John W. I believe my Nui venison would rather have the deer gone because the grass is more productive for ranching cows. So it's a comment, it doesn't include a question, but just want to pass it.
Yeah, and I know Maui Nui Venison works with the ranching community on Maui. Yeah, there's common goals there.
Sorry, a number of other hands.
Yeah.
I don't know about lessons. You said you could share lessons or advice you'd give, for this group.
Yeah.
Teachers.
Well, I mean, I continue to learn every time I do it. I think because the nature of this project, we go to a new island and there's always things to learn from new island and working with new people. I think my biggest lesson is like working with others. I think this work in particular is really difficult to do by yourself. Like we're going to different areas all across the island, in different land jurisdictions and things like that. And so oftentimes people are more than willing to help. And so just reaching out to those individuals, I think would be a big lesson. I think when I was initially doing it, especially in grad school, you layer on the stress and like you've got your project but it's not just your project. You can work with others, and most people will be willing to help you through that process. Yeah.
Maybe along those lines, Derek, I know for many of these students, So something that you've gone from undergrad to grad school to now being an RCUH hired coordinator on this, and you had to navigate, for lack of I think this is an oversimplification, but three communities that often don't get along with agriculture, conservation, and hunting. And not to say someone can't be all three, they certainly are. But oftentimes those communities are pointing fingers or talking past one another and casting blame. And as a researcher in that space, how have you kind of navigated working amongst those communities, bringing people together and being able to serve all three needs?
That's a loaded question. I think the biggest thing is just listening. I think like, yeah, there's so much to learn from these different communities and coming in knowing that you don't know what that person knows. I think has helped me better understand these needs across different user groups and people interested in field management. You know, in the last year we started working with ranchers and I had no experience with ranching prior to that. And so we had attended the Cattlemen's Council last year and I basically just sat there and listened the whole time. And so there's a lot to learn from different people, whether you have a stake in what they do or not. And yeah, I think, I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, listening before you speak, I think, would be my advice, yeah. Especially as a researcher, I think like, as a researcher, my job is to like assist with these decisions. I'm not making any of the decisions. I'm here to listen and learn about what information might be needed. And so before I interject and whatever, I would like to like know what's needed and what information I can help out with.
Now that you've spent this much time listening, and you do advise managers and you've gathered this data to inform management, if it was up to you, what sorts of, different game management approaches would you put into place, or what would you do to deal with some of these various species and distributions of them?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of site specific. There's certain areas like on Maui, for example, where we were seeing pretty significant changes between seasons of like pig distribution. When there was hunting going on in an area, the pigs behave very differently than when there wasn't hunting. And so in that situation, in that forest reserve, there was seasonal hunting. That's not always the case. Sometimes, or I think in most cases, there's year-round hunting. And so I think when you dive a little deeper, and I'd have to like the data and stuff, but like when you dive a little deeper, there's helpful suggestions to management. In that case, like I would say hunt year-round. That was actually the most pigs I've ever seen on any of our game cameras in that forest reserve. And when the hunting season ended, we were seeing that the pigs were going further out from that forest reserve. So when they were hunted, they were really constrained in a particular area. And then when they weren't hunted, they were kind of venturing out. And it was problematic because right at the boundary of the forest that they were predominantly in is like, some of the last remaining intact Momane forest on Maui. And so they were venturing out into those areas. And so that's just one case in point, but those kinds of things you can pick up on our models if you look closely. I think actually for Kauai, for your reference, black-tailed deer was actually a really interesting one because I think you don't really see them. Like the whole time that we were surveying there, we never observed one. Never in all the areas that we were surveying, we pick them up on the cameras all the time, but they're very cryptic. And so what we were seeing is that a lot of the areas, like I showed, where it's like really intact forest, we had to get flown in there. There were a lot of animals. And so just realizing that and observing that on our game camera is like, how can you better control those populations in those areas where it's difficult to introduce management. So yeah, I don't know. There's little pockets and things that you can tease out from those, overall heat maps. But
Well, I think thank you, Derek, for leaving such a big time for questions. Coming up next week, we have another alumni talk from Luca Zavas, who the last few years has been working as the outreach manager for Birds Not Mosquitoes and the American Bird Conservancy, working on public outreach and education on the forest bird conservation programs. And so she'll be here presenting, which is really great. We've got a number of other alumni talks coming up, so we hope you're here same time, same place each week. Derek, if folks want to use any of your models, those are spatial layers, just like rainfall, just like vegetation, that are now available for almost every island across the Hawaiian Islands. So if you're needing some of those spatial layers for your research, how can they get those if they're interested in using them in some of their research?
Well, right now, just email me, so I have my email up there, but flyer. I don't know, it's something I can share with you if you want to come talk to me, but right now, email me. We're working on trying to figure out a place where we can put them as a repository for people interested in using them, but yeah, right now, just email me.
All right, we have food. You're welcome to stick around and have some, and we'll see you next week.